Welcome to our UX Psychology Meetup number 15, The Paradox of Choice with Professor Barry Schwartz. Before we start, we'd like to mention that we pressed the record a bit too late, but only a few seconds of the beginning are missing, so we hope this doesn't detract from your enjoyment of the event. So enjoy Professor Barry Schwartz.
Completely free to study whatever they want. In the world of work, we saw this most dramatically in COVID, but it was true before COVID. The digitization and computerization of the work that many of us do makes it possible for us to work from anywhere on the planet, on any day of the week, at any hour of the day, leading some people to say, I just want to go home, crawl into bed, and do some more work. We are free to work all the time. Retirement plans, again in the US, there used to be a company pension, and it went from a company pension to some version of a 401k where individual employees put money into a retirement account and the employer matched them to some degree. And there will be a few options available to employees. And what has happened over the years is those few options have now become dozens and maybe even as many as 100 different options for you to choose among when it comes to putting your retirement money away. And in marital and family arrangements, even. There was a time in our history when the answer to the question, should I get married, was for almost everybody, yes. In fact, it was so much yes that people didn't ask the question. The answer to the question, should I have children, was yes. And here too, it was so much yes that people didn't ask the question. The only question people asked was who? Who should I marry? And as we can all attest, even that one question, people manage to give the wrong answer to an awful lot of the time. But now, it seems to me, these sorts of choices of lifestyle are very much up for grabs. Everything is possible. Every imaginable family arrangement is possible. And again, let me emphasize, this is good, but it also poses problems that we didn't have to face at an earlier point in our cultural history. And to me, the clearest evidence of this explosion of choice that has been brought by the digital age is these two companies. Look for anything on Amazon and you will find a list of possibilities that is simply exhaustive and exhausting. And to me, the latest culprit is Netflix or other streaming services. I can't tell you how often I have decided to take it easy in the evening and watch a movie and gone to Netflix and spent an hour trying to decide what movie to watch, after which I threw up my hands in disgust and just read a book. And so I regard the modern choice problem as the Netflix problem. So the world used to look like this, where some things were written in stone, and now it looks more like this. And the question is this good news or bad news? And the answer is yes. And we all know what's good about it. And I'm not going to spend any time talking about what's good about it because I assume we're all agreed that having all this choice is good. What we have failed to understand as cultures is that it isn't only good. There's a dark side to having all this choice, and the dark side can actually do real damage. And that's what I'm going to focus on for the rest of my talk. What does too much choice do? The first problem is that instead of liberating people, when there are too many options, it paralyzes people. They can't decide. They can't pull the trigger. Sheena Iyengar did the first research on this. There's a famous study buying jam where a fancy food store, its standard practice when it got a new product was to put the product on a display table and let people sample the product. And so they got these expensive jams imported from England. And one day they put 24 different flavors of the jam on the table and let people sample. And if you came to the table and sampled, you got a coupon that would save you $1 on any jam you bought. A few days later, they put 6 of the same jams on the table. And again, if you sampled, you got a coupon that would save you $1 on any jam you bought. And strikingly, more people were attracted to the table when it had lots of jam than when it only had a few, but 1/10 as many people actually bought jam. I'll repeat that, 1/10 as many people. Why? Because they couldn't figure out which jam to buy. So they threw up their hands in disgust and bought nothing. She showed the same thing when it came to retirement investing. If you look at different companies that offer their employees different numbers of investment opportunities, from a few to a dozen to over 100, what you find is that the more options you offer people, the less likely they are to participate. And so by doing a favor for employees, by giving them all these options, what you were actually doing was inhibiting their inclination to put money aside for their retirement. And this, as I said, is what I think Netflix is doing as it tortures us. So that's problem number one. We're trying to liberate people with all this choice, and instead we're paralyzing people. The second problem is the one that I have focused most of my attention on, which is if you overcome paralysis and choose, you will end up less satisfied with what you've chosen than if you had fewer options to choose from. Too much choice reduces satisfaction, and it does this for several reasons. First, when there are lots of options, it becomes easier for you to regret the option that you've chosen, because it is easier for you to imagine that one of the alternatives that you rejected would have been better. When there are 2 kinds of jeans to buy, there's less opportunity for you to regret the brand that you bought. When there are 4 entrees on the restaurant menu, there's less opportunity for you to regret the entree that you've chosen. When there are 1,000 kinds of jeans available or 25 different entrees available, any little imperfection in the one you've chosen leads you to think that you could have done better. And the consequence of that is that you get less satisfaction of what you actually did choose. That's what regret does. It poisons the satisfaction that we get from our decisions. Anticipated regret in some ways is even worse, because the only way to avoid regretting the decision is by not making it. And so I think the worry that you will come to regret your decision contributes a great deal to the paralysis that we see when the number of options is large. Second, relatedly, missed opportunities. You may choose a dish in a restaurant, and when it comes, it's quite good, and you don't think you made a mistake. But the dish offered baked potato and broccoli as side dishes, and other dishes offered fried potatoes and beans. And you like fried potatoes and beans more than you like baked potatoes and broccoli. And so by choosing the one you've chosen, you missed the opportunity to have other things that might have given you more satisfaction. You don't think you made a mistake, but every bite you take of the broccoli, you're thinking about how much more you'd be enjoying the beans. So missed opportunities subtract from the satisfaction that we get from the decisions we make. And here's an example of that. I can't stop thinking about all those available parking spaces back on West 85th Street. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with New York City, it's hard to park a car in New York City, as it probably is in any city. And here this couple is on the beach in August, beautiful day. And all this man can think about is that because it's August, everyone in their neighborhood is away on vacation, and he could probably be parking his car right in front of his house. And if you spend 2 weeks at the beach thinking about all those missed parking spaces, you're not going to get much satisfaction out of those 2 weeks on the beach. Here's another illustration. Whoop. Forgive me, those two little rectangles are supposed to be hiding the nipples. I don't know how they somehow moved. If you spend your time at work thinking about golf, if you spend your time playing golf thinking about sex, and if you spend your time having sex thinking about work, you're not going to enjoy work or golf or sex nearly as much as you otherwise would. And the lesson here is that everything we choose means that there are alternatives that we're passing up. Thank you, Mark. And the thing that young people don't realize, and maybe some of you count among them, is that no matter how hard you try, you can really only do one thing at a time. And everything you choose to do means that there are lots of things you're choosing not to do. There is now a technical term out in the world to capture this: FOMO, fear of missing out. This is a big idea in the States. I don't know if it has moved across the ocean, but the idea is that people don't commit to a course of action because they're worried that something might come up that's more attractive than what they were thinking about committing themselves to, and then they'll regret having made the commitment. And so trying to decide what to do on a weekend, you keep postponing it and postponing it and postponing making plans because maybe something fabulous will turn up. And the result, of course, is that the weekend comes, you haven't made any plans, and it's sort of impossible to make them on the spur of the moment, so you end up having disappointing weekends. The comedian Aziz Ansari wrote a book called Modern Romance, which was mostly funny, but also had some serious points. And the theme of the book is how hard it is for an attractive, unattached young person to form lasting relationships in modern large cities like New York. And the problem is that it is so easy to encounter alternatives. And so any little thing about the person you're thinking about getting involved with that you don't like leads you to swipe right and see whether you can find somebody better. And if you're always looking for somebody better, if you're always looking over your partner's shoulder to see if somebody better is walking by, then the kind of commitment it takes to build a lasting and satisfying relationship, it doesn't seem to be worth the trouble. So this is a serious point he makes. And no, not everybody has this problem, of course, but a lot of people do have this problem. Not hard to get together with people in the short run, very hard to turn these short-term relationships into lasting relationships. And the deep point, the general point, is that everything suffers from comparison. And the more things you have to compare your option with, the more the option you've chosen will suffer. Okay, the next thing that does us in, when there are lots of options, is what I call escalation of expectation. if there are only two kinds of genes, how well do you expect the genes you buy to fit you? Unless you have a model's body, the answer is not very well. If there are 200 kinds of genes or 2,000 kinds of genes, how well do you expect the genes you buy to fit you? Well, now it's a whole different story. Out of those 200, surely one of them is perfect. And so when you go shopping for genes, you're no longer willing to settle for good enough fit. You want to find the genes that provide a perfect fit. So your expectations about how good your choice is going to end up being go up. And what we actually get virtually never meets these incredibly high expectations. These are expectations of perfection. And when we actually make the choice, we compare how good it is to how good we expected it to be, and everything falls short. Everything was better back when everything was worse. I don't want to romanticize poverty, but the important insight here, I think, is that when things were worse, expectations were modest. And when expectations were modest, it was possible to have experiences that met them or maybe even exceeded them. When what we expect is perfection, every decision we make is going to end up disappointing. And that probably includes your deciding to listen to me talk about this topic today, if there were lots of other things that you could be doing instead. This leads to a distinction that my colleagues and I made some years ago between two ways of thinking about making a decision. One, which is what economists encourage us to do, is the maximizing way. What looking only the best will do. And so your job when you face a choice is to find the best. The second is what we've called satisficing. And with a satisficing orientation, you're not looking for the best, you're just looking for good enough. You may have high standards in some areas and lower standards in others, but the point is that when you're looking for good enough, you search, and as soon as you find something that meets your standards, you stop searching. In contrast, if you're trying to find the best, you can't stop searching until you've examined every option. If there are only two options, there's not much of a difference between these two orientations. But when there are 200 options, there can be a huge difference. Here's an example of a maximizer. For those of you who don't know, Brown is a very, very excellent university in New England in the United States. If you go to Brown as a student, you're going to get a great education. But if you go to Brown as a student with that sweatshirt in your head, you will spend every day at Brown thinking about how much better things would be if only you had gotten into Yale. And that's no way to go to college. And here is a satisficer. This may be a good attitude to take when you decide to get married. You have found a good enough spouse. I know this is sacrilegious even to suggest, but I have a feeling that if we were looking for good enough romantic partners, our intimate relations would be more satisfying than they currently are. So we've done a lot of research. We created a scale to assess whether people are maximizers or satisficers in general. And there's no strict dividing line between them. I don't want to give that impression. It's a continuum. And what we find is that people who score on our scale as maximizers are more pessimistic, anxious, stressed, worried, tired, overwhelmed, depressed, regretful, and disappointed. None of that sounds good to me. On the other hand, they are less content, optimistic, elated, excited, and happy. In other words, being a maximizer is bad for your well-being. And there's another thing about maximizing, and about the explosion of choice. And this is work that's not in the book or in the TED Talk. I've done it the last few years with a former student of mine. And the idea that I want to communicate is this. When there are two kinds of genes, the genes you buy don't say anything to the world about who you are. There just isn't enough variety in the world of genes for the genes you choose to make a statement about who you are. When there are 2,000 kinds of genes, well, now, whether you wanted to or not, the genes you choose do make a statement about who you are. And so in a world in which choice has exploded, almost every decision we make is, in addition to feeding us, also telling the world something about who we are. And what that means is that even trivial decisions become important, because we may not care much about what genes we buy, but we care a lot about what impression we are making on the world as to our basic nature and our character. And what we have found with a whole host of trivial choices, like which restaurant, choosing a restaurant from a set of 5 or a set of 20, choosing a video to watch from a set of 5 or a set of 20, you name it, trivial things. What we find is that when people choose from a large choice set, they tell us that the choice they make is an indication, is an expression of some aspect of who they are. When there's a small choice set, people are less likely to say that what they choose is an expression of who they are. And because the stakes have gone up, the consequence is that people are more inclined to be maximizers. This is an important decision. This is telling the world something essential about me. I want to get this decision right. So the more options there are, the more what you choose expresses something about you. And the more what you choose expresses something about you, the more inclined you are to be a maximizer. And we saw that being a maximizer is bad for your mental health. Now, this is not always true. To use an American example, sometimes what you choose says something to the world about who you are, even if there aren't a lot of options. Which of these two stations you watch in US television says a lot about you to the world. Some of you may know this, but MSNBC is ridiculously left-wing and Fox News is ridiculously right-wing. And by watching what people watch, you learn something about them. And similarly, which of these two people you choose come November is going to tell the world a lot about you. But for the most part, when the option set is small, we learn less about people from their choices than we do when the option set is large. And this matters. There's a wonderful book by Gelfand that summarizes her work. She did a study across many nations, looking at how happy people were, how depressed they were, how suicidal, what the rate of suicide was, what the rate of heart disease was, diabetes, and life expectancy. And her interest was to see whether these things varied across countries as a function of how tight or loose they were socially and culturally. And this, a first approximation of what she means by tight and loose is lots of freedom of choice and less freedom of choice. So different countries, she wrote a book, Michelle Gelfand, Rule Makers and Rule Breakers. And it turns out countries differ in how tight they are culturally. This is a graph that moves from least tight to most tight. And most tight means least choice. And if you assess well-being, physical well-being and psychological well-being and life expectancy as a function of how tight or loose the culture is, what you find is a curve that looks like this. Cultures that are too tight, like Pakistan, everyone is miserable. Cultures that are too loose, like Ukraine, everyone is miserable. And the trick, well-being is on the y-axis, the trick is to find the sweet spot, the point that has just the right mix of tightness and looseness. And so, in general, when it comes to choice, there's a good reason to think that the relation between the amount of choice people have and their well-being and satisfaction is in the shape of an inverted U, like you see in this graph. Too little choice, people are miserable. Too much choice, people are miserable. The sweet spot is what you're looking for. And unfortunately, it's not simple to say what the sweet spot is. It may differ from person to person. It may differ from one domain of decision-making to another. But what is pretty clear is that just because choice is good does not mean that more choice is better. So how can choice be good and bad? The assumption that we often make in the social sciences is that the relation between a variable and an independent variable and a dependent variable is monotonic. So the more you have of X, the more you get of Y. And what I have just suggested to you is that at least in the case of choice, that's not true. So this is a schematic of how I understand how it can be that choice is good and bad. This captures what's good about choice. On the y-axis is subjective state. On the x-axis is number of choices. And you can see that when you have no choice, life is essentially infinitely bad, all the way on the left. As you increase the number of choices people have, life gets better and better, but the benefits flatten out. So this shows choice is good. But a point is reached where there's really significant diminishing marginal returns as you keep increasing the number of choices people have. In addition, the things I've been talking about indicate that there are respects in which choice is bad. It isn't very bad when there are only a few options, but the negatives, the paralysis, the raised expectations, the regret, and so on, grow as the number of options grows. And that's what the second curve captures. And so when you want to know how it feels to have any given amount of choice on this graph, what you do is you add these two curves together. And when you do that, this is what you get. You get the inverted U. No choice is horrible. The right amount of choice is wonderful. And if you exceed the right amount of choice, the inverted U appears, and you can make people sufficiently miserable that they actually go below neutral. And that's what I think is the case when it comes to understanding the relation between the amount of freedom of choice people have and the amount of well-being they have. And the trick is to find the sweet spot. Good luck finding it. I hope you all look for it in your own lives and in the lives of the people you consult with. So what is the relation between choice and happiness? The country Grandpa came from was a stinking hellhole of unspeakable poverty where everyone was always happy. Well, that's not true. People are not happy in stinking hellholes of unspeakable poverty. But what research has indicated is the single most important factor in determining how happy people are, how much well-being people have, is the close relations that they have with other people. The social connectedness that people feel seems to be more important than anything else. And the thing to think about when it comes to close relations is that close relations don't liberate us, they constrain us. The more tightly connected we are to our family, the harder it is to move across the country to take a job. the more tightly connected we are to our family, the harder it is to choose a lifestyle of which our family disapproves. Other people matter, and the more that they matter to you, the more your choices are going to be influenced by the effects that your choices have on them. So close relations constrain us, and yet they are the most important aspect, determinant of our well-being. And here I think what we are all experiencing, all rich countries are now experiencing, which is the extraordinary decline in the well-being of young people, can be partly understood by understanding what too much choice does. Young people, what should I buy? Young people, what should I do? Fear of missing out. Young people, who should I do it with? Marriage and friendship. Young people, who should I be? It is hard to answer these questions, much harder now than it used to be. It's hard to see how you could live your life without answering these questions. So these questions impose themselves on you, whether you want them to or not. And I think the effort to answer these questions, much more difficult in a world of unlimited choice than in a world of constrained choice, the effort to answer these questions contributes to the stress, anxiety, depression, drugs, and suicides that we are seeing increasingly in our young people. They never should have allowed us to be free range. The problem is that when you are free range, you can end up a tropical bird amid icebergs. Being free to make choices means that you are free to make choices that might end up being quite devastating. You can be anything you want to be, no limits. Now, obviously, in this fishbowl, it's nothing but limits. And I think we're supposed to, our first reaction to this is supposed to be, though this idiotic, myopic parent fish has no idea what's possible outside the fishbowl. Shame on it. Shame on the parent fish. And that was my first reaction. But the more I thought about it, the more it occurred to me that what would happen if this fishbowl got shattered and the fish were really free to do anything. Almost all that could happen would be catastrophic. And so I came to believe that everyone needs a fishbowl. And the critical question for people interested in psychology to ask is what needs to be in the fishbowl, in the constraints, within the constraints, to enable people to live satisfying and meaningful lives. The one thing I'm now completely convinced of is that shattering the fishbowl, giving people unlimited choice, does nobody a favor. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Very inspiring as always. Let me just, so are there any questions? I have lots of, but let us have our attendees first. Any questions? Oh yes, I have applause. If you just want to speak up, or I can unmute you. Or let me just, I start with a question to get people like kind of warmed up. It really struck me that I've never thought about what you say, that decisions that we make, if we have many choices, are a statement about ourselves. This is really nothing that I've been thinking of in this way. I guess it's very much an depends on what the subject is, but do you have any recommendations on how do I know up to at what point does it really matter? How much choices do I have to have so that it is a statement, or does it really depend on whether it's dressing in politics or whatever?
I wish I could answer that question. We've done studies involving a bunch of different things where what we do is vary the number of options people see. Mm-hmm. they've all been the kinds of things that you wouldn't expect people to regard as making statements about themselves, right? Is it a statement about yourself, which Italian restaurant you choose? Well, it turns out that if there are 5 options, it isn't a statement about yourself. If there are 25 options, it is.
Yeah.
So I don't know what the magic number is, except to say the more freedom of choice, the more options there are, the more we invest in the option we choose as a statement about what we value, which means as a statement about who we are. And that's true, as I say, even of trivial things. It's even more true when the stakes go up. But having a lot of options makes the stakes go up. But I have no answer to the question, when does this kick in? And it's not always bad. I mean, sometimes it's a good thing for people to think about what they choose as a statement about who they are. You know, if you're interested in preserving the environment, you want to encourage people to think that what they choose is a statement about who they are and what they value, since almost every consumer decision we make has environmental consequences. So that's not necessarily bad, but it sure makes it harder to make choices.
I mean, it makes it even harder. Yeah. Great. Let me see. We've got one question. When we think, thank you, Hardik. When we say question, when we think about fishbowl and compare it with getting out of the comfort zone, can you relate to that?
I think that's what the fishbowl is. It's a comfort zone. But the problem here, too, is that it's not always a comfort zone, right? You're in this fishbowl and all you see is the things that are inviting to you that are outside the fishbowl. You know, not so long ago, if you were gay, life was miserable for you pretty much anywhere in the world. That has changed in some places. And so here you are living in a heterosexual fishbowl, wanting to break out so that you can actually be who you are. And that's why it really is a challenge to figure out what we need to put into the fishbowl so that it does become a comfort zone for everyone. And the challenge, and we're certainly seeing this in the growth of sort of the return of gay bashing in the US, is that when you make the fishbowl a comfort zone for some people, you will make it less of a comfort zone for others. That's the challenge. So that, you know, when I add homosexuality to the fishbowl, people who are put off by homosexuality will be a little less comfortable in that fishbowl than they were before. So it's very hard to get this balance right. I don't think you can do it by formula.
Wonderful. Okay, thank you. Carolina, you put up your hand and then we go through the next ones in the chat.
Thumbs up from Hardik. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Is context maybe a determining factor of choices? I'm thinking of the following example. When I'm in a like you described, in a grocery store or in a supermarket with, I don't know, 100 different types of canned fish, or something like that. When I'm in a supermarket in Austria, which is my home country, I simply can't decide. But when I'm on holiday, say, and I don't know the brands that well or the different types, I just, let's try this one. So it's easier to, I find it easier to choose. Is it sometimes, is it possible that the context is an influential factor in making choices? Or I don't know, what's your opinion on that?
No, I'm sure the context is, but your description of how you react to being in a novel environment doesn't match everyone. I had a student some years ago who spent a semester studying in Australia. So she went to the grocery store, and all of the brands were unfamiliar to her, just as you're describing. describing.
Mhm.
She said she spent 4 hours looking for a dozen items because she didn't know how to even begin the search. So
Okay.
what you were able to do that she was not is you were able to relax your standards, and say basically to yourself, what difference does it make? I didn't come here to eat canned fish. I came here, for other reasons. And she was unable to do that. So she used the same sort of intense analysis in a domain that she was essentially completely unfamiliar with, and she found it torturous. So I think the context matters, but what also matters is how an individual adjusts to the context. The way we manage to get through the grocery shopping that we do is probably that 95% of what we buy is the same stuff we bought last week. And so we're only agonizing about a few things. Well, if you didn't buy any of these things last week, then you end up agonizing about everything, unless you adopt your attitude and say, what difference does it make? So yes, context matters, but it doesn't affect each of us in the same way.
All right, thank you. Thank you.
Let's carry on with the next question, if I may. Are there any areas that don't cause negative outcomes from an increase in choice?
Well, we haven't found any. I do think that even in choice in the crazed United States, there are areas where there is insufficient choice, and the political arena is one of them. The fact of the matter is that we typically choose between two candidates, no matter what the office is that we're just voting in. And that's just not enough to capture the range of feelings people have about policy and ideology. And so, it feels to a lot of people like you're always choosing the lesser evil. And that hardly inspires enthusiasm about democracy. Now, there are problems with having 20 candidates too. Sometimes societies become essentially ungovernable when there are too many options. But we have too few options in the US. But we have not, as far as I know, no one has found an area where the more choice people have, the better.
Thank you. And you see, politics, like in Austria, we have, depending on the vote, but we have something between 4 and 7 parties, and we always choose the the least evil. Nobody really with enthusiasm. Yeah. Okay. Timo question. Is there a way to limit choices, or are we already at the point of no return?
Yeah. Well, for those of you who know something about research and decision making, people are what's called loss averse, which means that when you lose something, it has a bigger effect on you than gaining the equivalent thing would have. We are particularly sensitive to loss. And so if you think about reducing choices as entailing loss, at least for some people, then I suspect that we may have passed the point of no return. Certainly the government's not going to legislate how many different kinds of salad dressing supermarkets can sell. That's just not in the cards in any of our countries. So a lot of this choice limiting has to be done by the consumer rather than by the provider, the producer. You have to adopt strategies so that no matter how many things are out there, you're only going to look at a subset. And I think the single most important thing you can do in that regard is to adopt the attitude of a satisficer, looking for a good enough cereal, a good enough salad dressing, a good enough job, et cetera, because then you don't feel the compulsion to examine every possibility. So that no matter how many options the world is offering, you're only going to look until you find one that meets your standards, and then you're going to stop looking. So I think we probably have passed the point of no return. And it's up to us as individuals to take an impossibly complicated and frustrating set of choices and reduce them to a manageable size. And to raise our children up to appreciate that that's a good way to live your life.
Yeah, that's a good point. Many of us, or also our attendees, work somewhere in the area of user experience, system development as such. What would you recommend? How can we inform our clients who say, oh, we want this feature, that feature,
Yep.
to decrease that?
That's a terrific question. And there was a study done a long time ago, roughly a few years after my book came out, user experience, where they would give people, I don't remember what the device was. It was some sort of a music player. And they offered versions that were complex, that could do a lot of things, and versions that were simple. And invariably, the focus of consumers was on capability rather than usability. Because who knew what the future of technology was going to be? They wanted a device that whatever technology developed, that device could handle. Now, the problem is that no one figured out then, and I suspect this is still true, how to create an incredibly capable device that is simultaneously an incredibly usable device. There's a trade-off. The more potential it has, the more complicated it is. But again, if you trust the consumer seems to be drawn to capability. And what ends up happening, as I'm sure many of you know, is that it comes out of the box, you scratch your head, you put it back in the box, you put it in a closet saying, I'll figure it out next weekend, and it never leaves the box again. So it is really up to the designers of these things to design things that are less capable and more usable. Because when consumers are left to their own devices, they are likely to make mistakes when they're choosing. But maybe someone will figure out a way so that there doesn't have to be this trade-off. But in my experience, there's always a trade-off between capability and usability. And very few people appreciate that usability is almost certainly more important than capability. Yeah. So good luck, you UX people.
Yes. I think this is a big difference between UX and CX. CX when we target the customer, and UX when we try to target the user who really has to deal with the system. Let me see, just another questions dropping in. Just an observation by Babenko. I hope Dennis, I pronounced your name correctly. Just an observation, Decathlon, the shop helps to choose by describing the differences between the products of the same type. Do you think that we have this law of distinction? Is it worthwhile?
So, I'm sorry, I'm not sure I got the question.
It was the observation that Dennis says, Decathlon, this is the sports supermarket, helps to choose by describing the differences between the products of the same type. Does it help?
Well, so there's a magazine in the US called Consumer Reports, and it evaluates different kinds of products. Simple products like, spaghetti sauce, complicated products like automobiles. And their standard article will include a gigantic spreadsheet that lists, 30 different versions of the product and 15 different features. Mm-hmm. And so what they are trying to do is exactly what the questioner asked. They are trying to show you the differences between the products. But when you buy a dishwasher, do you give a lot of thought to how noisy or quiet it is? There it is in this spreadsheet. Some are noisier than others. And I look at the spreadsheet and I say, should I care about how noisy or quiet a dishwasher is? Is this something I ought to be thinking about? And so it does not necessarily help to illustrate the differences because what you may do is make differences that actually are of no consequence to a potential purchaser into something that they suddenly need to feel like they need to be thinking about. So I don't know if that addresses your question, but I think here too, highlighting differences is a mixed blessing. It will benefit some people, and it will make the decision much more challenging for other people.
Oh, it's like the fishbowl. Whatever we do will be good for some and bad for the others.
I'm afraid that that's true. And, there are people, if you love cars, you may want there to be a million different kinds of cars on the market, and you may love nothing better than reading in detail about how each model differs from each other model, right? This is the highest of pleasant experiences.
Mm-hmm.
So make a million cars and let that person go crazy, good for you.
Mm-hmm.
But if you if you just want a car that runs and doesn't break down, then all of this is just going to make choosing a car into a nightmare. So, you can't legislate, because you may love cars and I may love spaghetti sauces. So I can have as many spaghetti sauces as the world wants to offer me, and it's the more the merrier. And you can have as many cars as the world offers you, and it's the more the merrier. And the result is that we have what we have now, which is way too many in virtually every category.
This is maybe a bit too off topic, but if you say like somebody loves spaghetti sauce or cars, and is it so that if somebody really loves the things he or she has to choose from, isn't it so that it's even more hurtful not to get the 9,000 other spaghetti sauces that you can't have?
Well, that's another problem that I didn't have time to go into. But as the number of options goes up, the differences among the candidates get smaller and smaller and smaller.
Mm-hmm.
When there are 1,000 spaghetti sauces and you eliminate 900, how different are the remaining 100 from each other?
Mm-hmm.
And I'll tell you where we see this dramatically and very consequentially in the US. Very selective universities. Stanford University, I think the most selective university in the US these days, rejects 96% of the people who apply. 96%. Now, I assure you, bad students do not apply to Stanford University. So the 96% who are being rejected are all good students.
Mm-hmm.
And do you think that the 4% who are accepted are obviously different from all of the ones who are rejected? No. What these poor people in admissions departments do is they have to manufacture differences in order to say yes to this one and no to that. Differences when you're at the extreme of the distribution are so tiny that they don't matter. But you can't admit everybody. And I think the problem as the choices proliferate is indeed that you will end up with a lot of candidates that are essentially indistinguishable from each other, and you'll struggle to find a way to make the distinction.
Oh, interesting. Let me read another question. Dating apps applies also to restaurant, hotel apps, whatever. A great example of fear of missing out and paradox of choice. How could a UX designer help in this situation?
Well, here is what I think is the single best thing that UX designers can do, and I think this is already being done, and that is to pay enormous attention to what the defaults are. The way to satisfy people who don't want to get involved with complexity is to create a device that out of the box will be doing what almost every user wants it to do. And the more adventurous types or the more technologically sophisticated types can figure out the other things that the device is capable of. But for ordinary people, you just plug it in and it does what you're looking for. And it takes a lot of research, I suspect, especially with complex devices, to know what it is that the defaults should be. You need to know your customers. But if you did that carefully, then I suspect you could, to some degree, solve the usability capability problem, since you would set up defaults that make the device usable for the overwhelming majority of the people who are looking at the device. So you basically hide the capability under a cloak and let people who care figure out the capability. And meanwhile, the rest of us are using the new computer 10 minutes after we plug it in. So I think that's the best we can do.
Would you agree to the statement, something like choosing the default is no active choice, but it's just no choice?
Well, you know, there's been research on this. You may be aware of this. In many countries, when you renew your driver's license, you are asked whether you want to be an organ donor.
Okay.
In some countries, rate of organ donation is close to 100%. In other countries, it's more like 25%. The difference is that in the countries that have high rates of organ donation, you are an organ donor unless you say no. In countries with low rates, you are not an organ donor unless you say yes. And so, I mean, you could say, well, the default means no choice, but of course you are free to choose. You know, if the default is you're an organ donor, you could say it's against my religion not to be buried. I won't be an organ donor. So the choice is there. It's just that what you're doing is the default makes a particular kind of choice easy because you don't have to do anything to choose it, and another kind of choice hard. And if you know your customers well enough, you can design things so that the easy choices are the choices that people would make if they were forced to choose. So I think there's it really, you are really not taking choice away from people, but you're just making it, you're lubricating the path to the choices that most people would make if you basically just gave them a huge menu.
Great. Any other questions? Thank you. Any other questions? Mark.
I have also one question. Yeah, you were talking about young people, and I have 5 of them at the moment at home. How do you see the connection between the evolution of the paradox of choice in the digital era and young people's mental well-being, and in a world where algorithms and AI could help us choose from an abundance of options? Could these technologies not only intensify the paradox, but also lead to an increase in decision-making, overwhelm, associated mental like depression? And at the same time, might these technologies also offer ways to improve such mental strains by just simplifying the decision-making process?
The answer is yes and yes.
Yeah.
I focused on what my take is on how this choice explosion is hurting young people. But yes, they could, you could find ways to orchestrate and organize options so that choosing becomes easier rather than harder. First, you have to recognize that you've created a problem, and then you can try to solve the problem. And I think that there's an ideology in our societies that giving people options is not a problem. And as long as that's true, the effort to solve the problem isn't going to get a whole lot of steam. But I do think that I think this has, and let me also say that the explosion of social media also exacerbates the problem, because every choice you make, you have rubbed in your face the choices that other people are making that look better than the one that you made. So the pressure on young people to make choices that everyone in their network will approve of just raises the stakes of every decision. And that's doing nobody a favor. So yeah, technology can, right? You got nuclear power and you got nuclear weapons. Technology can certainly creates problems, and sometimes it can help to solve them. But I just haven't seen a whole lot of effort put into, the closest they come to trying to solve this problem is they offer you online reviews of things. And that turns out to, in my mind, to be much less helpful than you would think, since people disagree about how good a particular one is. And if you start studying reviews, you get more confused, not less confused. So yes, technology may get us out of this fix, but people have to devote a lot of attention to it.